Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Magic Occult Radio. I am your host, Taliesin McKnight, and I am here with my co-host, Theophilos Peleus. And today we have a very important interview with Dan Attrell, aka the Modern Hermeticist. And today we're discussing a very important book. Today we're discussing a new translation of the Picatrix. This is an extremely important text for the history of Western esotericism. Um, Before we begin, I'll just let the viewers know that below in the description box, you should see a link to the text, to the book. So if you want to go ahead and pre-order, then be sure and click the link and so that you can get your copy of this Picatrix. So the Picatrix is a manual for constructing talismans, mixing magical compounds, summoning planetary spirits, and determining astrological conditions. Picatrix is a cornerstone of Western esotericism. It offers important insights not only into occult practices and beliefs, but also into the transmission of magical ideas from antiquity to the present. Dan Attrell and David Porica's English translation opens the world of this vital medieval treatise to modern-day scholars and lay readers. So Dan Attrell is a doctoral candidate in medieval and Renaissance history, studying the Western esoteric tradition at the University of Waterloo. So we're very happy to have you here with us today, Dan.
Well, thanks for having me, guys.
Yes, it's an honor.
Oh, yes, very much so, very much an honor.
So could you tell us a little bit about the Picatrix? That was originally an Arabic text, is that right? And it had an major impact on Western esotericism?
That's right. So the Ghayat al-Hakim was written sometime around 954 to 959. And it was put together by a man of many charms and talismans named, and it's a mouthful, Abu al-Qasim Maslama ibn al-Qasim Ibrahim al-Qurtubi al-Zayat, or for short, al-Qurtubi. And this is an attribution that's been uncovered by the manuscript research of Liana Seif. And I'm very excited that we can include some of her discoveries in our edition. Our translation focuses on the Latin side of the reception. So the Ghayat al-Hakim, the goal of the sage, was written in Iberian Spain, in Andalusia, or Al-Andalus. And this was a period of, I guess you could call, cultural syncretism. There was a lot of exchange between all sorts of different language groups going on at this time. And we're also kind of at the height of the Islamic Golden Age. And so it was safe to travel. It was safe to go about and do your pilgrimages to Mecca, hit up some major cities along the way. And al-Qurtubi took these travels and he journeyed about and he collected a whole bunch of works during this time. And he claims to have, and I believe him, to have put the book together from about 200 sources. So he searched high and low for all of the most effective magic that he could find and put it together in this giant manual that is essentially a theoretical and a practical guidebook. So you'll find a lot of texts, magical texts, and it's usually one or the other. It's usually entirely practical recipe books, this sort of thing, instructions on how to make talismans, astrological instructions, or it's strictly theoretical, concerns with the makeup of the universe, cosmology, Neoplatonic theories of being, theories on rays, for example, the physics of light, the physics of the soul. These are things that people were concerned with at the time. And the Ghayat al-Hakim and subsequently the Picatrix, which makes its way into Europe, is a kind of vessel for all of these ideas. So we get ideas from Spain, from North Africa, from Egypt, from Greece, from Nabatea, from Arabia, from Babylon, Persia, India, so forth. It's extremely syncretic. And that is an extremely important piece of Western esotericism, because before the 12th century, there's kind of a dearth of occult texts in Europe. A lot of those come into Europe from the East, or I guess from the West in this case, since they're coming in from Spain. But it really had a lot to do, at least the reception of the Picatrix in the West, with the court of Alfonso X. Now, Alfonso is well known as having established these great translation movements. He would patronize all sorts of different translators. You have Jewish translators, Arabic translators, Latin translators, and they're exchanging all of this information. And Picatrix is one of these books, which was commissioned by King Alfonso to be translated into first Castilian and then eventually into Latin. The Castilian doesn't exist anymore. It's only in fragments. It might resurface, who knows, but it's largely the Latin version, which made its way around Europe. And it was in the libraries of Marsilio Ficino, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, and even Pico della Mirandola, though all of these people had kind of varying degrees of approval or disapproval about the work, because they have different systems of magic than the, let's say, causal magic of the Picatrix.
Okay, what do we know about the author as far as you can tell?
Well, we don't know much. What we know is that it's not Majriti, which was who Ritter and Plesner were the German translators of the Ghayat al-Hakim. So they actually did an edition, and they took a long time to do it. Basically took the whole first half of the 20th century to get it done. The war had a big part in messing everything up, and there were accusations of homosexuality and running away to Turkey, and some crippling depression, and all sorts of things were going on in that time that were delaying the publication of the work. These guys were living in Nazi Germany. And what they thought was that the author was one al-Majriti, or eventually this was softened to pseudo al-Majriti, so maybe one of his students. The problem was that nobody ever really attributed this work to him. There's no reference to this work being his, so it was really just kind of an educated guess. And since then, it's changed. And again, this is based on manuscript work in the Arabic tradition, which is not something that I've myself done. So I'm working from Liana Seif's discoveries, and it has been argued by others as well, like Maribel Fierro and so forth, that Maslama al-Qurtubi, as opposed to Maslama al-Majriti, he lived about a century earlier. He was known by his contemporaries as a man of many charms and talismans. We know he would have traveled, that he would have been an upper class individual. There's definitely an element of magical elitism going on in the Picatrix. That's why you get all these injunctions to secrecy and, among other reasons. But there's not terribly much that we can say concretely about him, other than what we can deduce from his selections. Like, why does he pick the spells that he picks? Everything about his selection bias kind of comes through when you look in the text, because he could have drawn from other books as well. We have to kind of read between the lines, and we get an idea that this was a man who was deeply entrenched in the wisdom of the 10th century, and for him, there is no distinction between, let's say, science as we understand it today and magic. These are two interpenetrating things. Magic operates on a cosmological worldview based on rays that emanate from the Ruhaniyah, and they come down and they can be averted or strengthened with specific operations, particularly the use of talismans. So, yeah, there's not much we can concretely say about the author. So that's why our work is largely concerned with reception. How were these ideas received? How were some of them sanitized, or how were they changed to fit in a Christian context? How did this worldview affect Europeans? One of the really important sources that is actually only we only have a surviving version of it in Latin, and that's Al-Kindi's work on rays, De Radiis. And Picatrix is very much in line with this system of rays and astrological calculations based on the geometry of the planetary arrangements. And these were theories that were invented in the Arabic world during commentaries on Plotinus. So people often like to think of the Arabic world as kind of just a receptacle of Greek ideas, and that's not fair. They're not a receptacle, and they're not just synthesizers either. They really innovated some systems in magic that were not in the Greek world prior to the Arabic reception of these texts. So, for example, there was a movement of Syriac translators, and this is kind of a side tangent. And when the Arabs came into the area, they wanted to secure their positions in their basically in their courts as bureaucrats. They wanted good paying jobs. And you could make a living just translating a couple books a year, or not even translating, just copying, like Ptolemy's works or Euclid's Elements. You could just translate one of these and sell it and live fairly comfortably. So there were people going and getting these astrological works from these kind of musty old libraries where these books were not really being taken care of. And so these were copied, but they didn't just blindly copy things. They also corrected the astrological calculations along the way and came up with these innovative systems of dealing with discrepancies. And so from that, we see, oh, well, they actually had their own astronomical traditions before the Greeks showed up. I mean, obviously, astrology begins with the Babylonians, so there would be an indigenous tradition for the Chaldeans or the Nabateans or the Syriac-speaking people of astrology that is not purely Greek, that is synthetic of native Greek, Hellenistic, and also Indian sources. And so we get some of that in Picatrix. We get these theories of magic that you wouldn't find in, let's say, the PGM, because it's rooted in a different system, one that's based on definitely Plotinus's theories of emanation, but also it's synthetic with works of Plato, works of Aristotle, works of the Brethren of Purity, works of these Arab astrologers, guys like Al-Kindi or Abu Mashar. So it really is kind of a culmination of many, many traditions, and we can deduce some things about its author from that. But it's kind of hard to make concrete statements. One thing that we definitely want to do is not think of the author as just a compiler. A lot of people think of this as, oh, he's just taking bits and pieces and copying and pasting, and this is the end result. And that's not true. There's a lot of innovation that goes along the way, a lot of correction, a lot of changes, so this is like a living tradition, basically. And we wanted to tap into that living tradition and see how it was received in the West. And so our translation reflects the reception of this tradition in the Renaissance, in basically after it resurfaces in the 1450s.
Wow, that's really amazing. And what I find really amazing about this is that, okay, this text is from the 10th century, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Around that time period. So from the 10th century, and here we are over 1,000 years later, and we're having this tradition revived. So kind of putting it into perspective that instead of just circulating modern occult books from like the 19th, 20th centuries, like we literally have this gem, this text from over 1,000 years ago. And like you said, this came from around 200 sources. So, and of course there was innovation and everything, like you said, he put his stamp on it, or whoever the compiler was, he put his stamp on it. But basically in the 10th century, well over 1,000 years ago, this person was drawing on, you said, like 200 different sources.
Mm-hmm.
So I imagine there's a lot of stuff, for one thing, that would otherwise probably be lost. But so over 1,000 years ago, this was like a collection of wisdom literature. So my question is, and again, I just want to remind the viewers that, be sure and look in the description box, and you'll see a link to this text so that you can purchase it yourself. But anyways, my question is, what are some of those sources for the Picatrix? Like over 1,000 years ago, he was drawing on these things. What are these other well springs of wisdom that he was drawing on?
Right. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of works. And there's a good article by David Pingree, who put together the Latin critical edition, and he calls it Some Sources of the Ghayat al-Hakim. I think that's the name of the article. But just to name a few, I mean, we can't be too exhaustive here, but one of the major influences is the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. Now, we have the works of al-Tabari. So al-Tabari was a Sabian, and now there are a ton of groups called Sabians in the Middle East, because the Quran extends protection to 4 different peoples of the books, and among those peoples are, or I suppose it extends 3 other people of the book other than Islam. So Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and Sabianism. And the Sabians were basically star worshippers. They were remnants of the ancient Babylonian cults, basically, pagan cults. Now, there are different groups of Sabians. There are Sabians in Yemen. There are Sabians in Haran, in eastern Turkey. There are a number of groups that go by this name because with it came this protection. And al-Tabari was one of these astronomers, astrologers, and he wrote extensively on, I guess, the science of astronomy, and that he makes up a big part of the works used in the Picatrix. Another source it is for sure. Sorry, Ibn Washia and his book called The Chaldean Agriculture. Sometimes you'll see it called The Nabatean Agriculture. This was a book written around the same time as the Picatrix, so slightly before. And it was basically, Ibn Washia was, a self-proclaimed Nabatean descendant, or descendant of the Nabateans. And he felt that they had an ancestral indigenous tradition rooted in that paganism of Babylon, that he wanted to maintain, because he felt that although he was a Muslim, he felt that the wisdom of the ancients was superior to the wisdom of the Arabs that were coming in and invading that territory. And so he wrote this book, The Chaldean Agriculture, in an attempt to demonstrate the superiority of the ancient Chaldeans over the new kind of barbarous Arab thinkers. So Ibn Washia also wrote on poisons. He wrote extensively on how to, basically on toxicology, on what are the symptoms of certain poisonings, what are the types of poisons that are used. And he made references to guys like Shanak, who's an Indian writer. And so there's a real accumulation, a syncretism of all these different ideas from India, from Greece. But what there also is layers of reception that divorce certain thinkers from their original context. So throughout the Picatrix, you'll find plenty of quotes of, let's say, Aristotle, and those come from the Liber Istimakis, which is kind of like a dialogue between Aristotle and Alexander. And it's like a work of advice where Aristotle is giving advice to Alexander. But obviously, this is a much later source. So somebody putting their words in the mouth of Aristotle and Alexander, and that's kind of being taken at face value by al-Qurtubi. Now, another figure you'll find often is Plato, but it'll say, Plato wrote 2 books, one greater and one lesser on magic, and in it he can teach you how to fly, how to teleport, how to ruin cities, how to do all this stuff. And like, we have a much better grasp of, Plato from antiquity today than they did in the Middle Ages, because they weren't fully temporalized. And so the Plato of the Picatrix is more of a sorcerer. He's more of this mystic figure that is more in line with these, Sufi initiators or something like that. It's not the same Plato that we think of, and it's not even the same text, the same books. Sometimes it is. He probably had access to the Timaeus, for example. But who else? So we've got al-Tabari, we've got Ibn Washia, we've got pseudo-Aristotle, pseudo-Plato. There's Jabir ibn Hayyan is another source, also known as Geber in the West. He was one of the more important figures in bringing alchemy to the West. And also we've mentioned Al-Kindi and the theory of rays, or Abu Mashar and how that applies to souls. And generally it just draws on the cosmology and the conception of the world that was inherited from the ancients. So what we would, I suppose, call the Ptolemaic model or the Aristotelian model. And that Ptolemaic model, we have Ptolemy plays a bigger role in the Picatrix, both the Tetrabiblos or the Centiloquium, which, that's attributed to Ptolemy, but it's not necessarily written by Ptolemy. That is the Centiloquium, not necessarily. The Tetrabiblos is, I think, pretty firmly attributed to Ptolemy. So yeah, there's a number of other sources as well. I mean, there's 200, but that's kind of the main ones that you would, if you wanted to do a study of the constituent sources of the Picatrix, you would go and you would read the Liber Istimakis, you would read the Chaldean Agriculture, you would read these works of the Brethren of Purity, these commentaries on Plotinus. And that would really give you an idea of the missing links, if you will, between the magic of late antiquity and the magic of the Middle Ages. There's a process that happens that a lot of people, I think, take for granted because they are in a post-Renaissance frame of mind, and that is that these planets are not really to be conceived of as gods. even though there are sacrifices to them in the traditional pagan manner, even though there are similarities between the practices from the Middle Ages and antiquity, late antiquity, that theurgical model of thinking about the gods is gone. It's been kind of overridden by this natural philosophical, natural magical worldview where God is at the supreme apex of being, and all the beings that he set beneath him, they're not autonomous gods. They're more like volitional forces. They're these beings that God sets in place in the cosmos in order to basically constitute the universe. And so we think, because we have inherited all of the classics, because we can read Virgil and Homer and all of this stuff, we read this and we kind of retroject our vision of the pagan gods onto these planets. But that's not really how they necessarily viewed them. That they had largely stripped that aspect away. And that's something that you find also in Europe as well, with the works of Albertus Magnus, who is working closely with Alcindes de Radiis and his theory of rays. You find that in Robert Grosseteste. You find that in Roger Bacon. And then on through Roger Bacon, he influences a whole bunch of people, and that includes, the Ficinos, the Picos, the Agrippas. That natural magical worldview is not as, let's say, spooky from within a Judeo-Christian or Islamic context as we like to think that it is. And that's something that really gets added with the grimoire traditions of the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, when you start getting these kind of more demonic type grimoires. These are prototypical of that, but they don't think of themselves as summoning demons. They think of themselves as pulling on the strings of creation, if you will, which are spirits, of course, but not the same as Dukes of Hell or anything like that.
All right, so it's interesting because in a modern world, I've noticed that especially we like to project our views on the past, and I think this is probably one of the greatest mistakes that we can make. And obviously definitions and terminology changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you've touched briefly upon that, so I guess I'll get to the heart of the matter. What was a magician at the time, and what studies did the magician have to undergo? That way we can have context to, how we can contrast this between modern and today.
Right. So a magician back then was not the same, of course, as a magician as we consider them now. A magician was somebody who learned the 7 liberal arts to the extent that they had a complete picture of the world. And now their worldview was different than ours, in that, obviously this depends on who you are. I'm talking from a feigned objectivity of a rational modernist person from the 21st century. But the idea was that you learned the makeup of the world, and then you could play it like a liar. You would find all of the hidden interconnections and analogies that yoked the world. Now, we think of the world as material made up of atoms moving around, and I mean, we also have quantum theory and all these kinds of things. But in the past, the world was conceived of as purely mental. And in being purely mental, what mattered most was hierarchy and analogy. So there's this kind of what Stephen Farmer calls the exaggeratedly correlative and hierarchical thinking of the Neoplatonic worldview. And this is the idea that all of reality operates not on, particles banging in space or chemical attractions or anything like that, but through hierarchy and analogy. And so once you had learned all of the things that you could learn from the sciences of the day, the culmination, the hidden, let's say, eighth liberal art that sat at the top of that liberal art pyramid was the ability to effect change in the world through the manipulation of natural forces. And so it was quite similar to the modern definition of magic, affecting change in consensus reality through an act of will. But the idea was that this could be done through hidden sympathies. And these hidden sympathies were on account of the links between the images in the heavens and the rays that carried those images down to Earth. And you could either, augment or repel or redirect or whatever it is, these rays, these energies that are spiritual in nature, they ultimately stem from God, but they pass through the heavenly spheres and they are affected by the ruhaniya, the spirits in those spheres that accompany the planets. And that is essentially what magic means. Now, the word magic means Persian priest. So the idea was there's this kind of Orientalism at work where in the Greek world, somebody else's religion, that is Zoroastrianism, was magic. They saw people doing fire rituals. They thought it was something different from what they normally experienced in their own ritual practices. And so they called that magic, or let's call it Persianness. And then eventually, over the centuries, that became stripped of that meaning, and it became more associated with the practices of theurgy. And so you see this, for example, in Apuleius, the Golden Ass, which is a 2nd century AD work. And by that point, the conception of magic more closely resembles what we think of it today. But there would be yet a number of centuries where this definition would be negotiated and constantly renegotiated. And it still is. I mean, you have as many definitions of magic as you have people interested in magic, and they're not necessarily contradictory either. The word that is used in the Picatrix in Latin is nigromancia. Now, a lot of people, now that's seer in Arabic, but a lot of people translate that simply as necromancy. And I have issues with this because of the way modern 21st century people understand the word necromancer. So if you read Lord of the Rings, you have Caradhras, for example, who is a necromancer. And in Tolkien's mind, that just means a sorcerer, because that was the old definition of nigromancia, which literally means black prophecy or black prophesying, black speak, manteia in Greek. It has this connotation of oracular utterances. And negro is black, whereas that's a bastardization of the word necro from the Greek tradition, necromanteia, and the Latin becomes nigromancia, which people then render as black magic. But again, this gives a bad idea as to what you're actually engaged with. But that doesn't come from back then. That comes from today. That comes from living in a post-Dungeons and Dragons, post-Diablo worldview, where we all grew up with necromancers, are these guys that live in dark crypts with skeletons and, raising the undead and stuff. And that's just not what the Picatrix is about. There are ritual operations, of course, that use animal parts and dead body parts and stuff like that, but they're not the sine qua non of the system. And they're also the whole thing about sacrificing animals and animal parts all has to do with astrological associations. It's not this like, I don't know, summoning of the nether forces of evil or anything like that. You're actually doing quite the opposite. So we've rendered in our translation the word nigromancia, we just rendered as magic, because that is the most neutral term that we can use to a modern 21st century audience. But yeah, so the idea of a magician is someone who masters the seven liberal arts, and included in that, of course, is things like geometry, astronomy, music. And once you have all of the knowledge of how harmonies work, how intervals work, how time passes, how once you learn the inner mechanics of the universe that you inhabit, you can start to play around with the inner mechanism of it. And that is basically how we ought to interpret the Picatrix. There's a lot of modern users use the Picatrix, but they apply a kind of psychological model. And that's what actually Ficino did when he was reading the Picatrix. He was kind of alienated by some of the more conjuration-y elements of it. His style of magic was more based on Orphic hymnody and using the actual like beat of the meter of the music and certain modes on his lyre and conjuring, or not conjuring in the sense of bringing in from another dimension, but calling down the spiritual energies from on high. And also because he was deeply entrenched in Neoplatonism in a way that not necessarily all the people practicing that form of magic were before him, he psychologized the Picatrixian style of magic more so than Picatrix itself is psychological. It is very much, I don't want to say material because that gives a bad idea, but it's the only term I've managed to come up with it is quasi-mechanistic, because it's like operating on not the spirit. It's really hard to not make these dichotomies because these are all modern dichotomies. Back then, all this stuff was pooled together in one contiguous thing.
It was like natural sciences, right?
Right. So, but even science, for example, so in the Middle Ages, you have Roger Bacon, and he has the Scientia Experimentalis. And so a lot of people contribute the roots of scientific thinking, or at least part of it, to Roger Bacon. But when he said that, he didn't mean what we think when we think of science, which is the scientific method, which is like making hypotheses and then trying to disprove our hypotheses. He meant it as you only believe the things that you can know through the senses. But modern science today is actually quite opposed to that way of thinking. And modern science is constantly telling us that our senses are wrong and that we need to do experiments in order to understand that our science is wrong. And so
the word you're looking for, would it be more like philosophy before the name? And when I talk about philosophy, I'm just not talking about the ponderance of life. Is that kind of the word you're looking for, like the philosophical arts of mathematics and
yeah, definitely. I mean, the goal of the sage is the name of the book, right? It's literally the goal of the philosopher, Hakim. It's related to the word chokmah in Hebrew, wisdom, right? That's probably the best. So the word science in the Middle Ages, which appears all over the place in the Picatrix, doesn't mean the same thing as science in a post-scientific revolution world. And so that's why in most cases we translated scientia as knowledge, or if it's scientia as in like multiple sciences, then we would say bodies of knowledge, because this takes away that modern retrojection of, oh, this is like science in the sense of a mass spectrometer or a giant telescope or something like that, because these were not the ways people were looking at the world. They had a different worldview. And it's better to consider things in terms that reflect how they perceive the world than how we moderns retroject our perception of the world through them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I know that there are many different rituals, many different formulas, and everything else, but just for our listeners to just get an idea, um, could you just give us an idea of kind of an example of, like, basically how would you go about making an astrological talisman, and or work with the spirit? Like, what is the theory behind it? And
Well, so I can talk in generalities, because if we go into specifics, we would have to start talking about specific astrological hours and that sort of thing. And
sure.
I don't want to overlook that, because that is literally what the book is about. So I don't want to downplay the importance of making talismans and what are the correct hours and stuff like that. But it really depends on the operation. So the idea is, and there are a number of different kinds of rituals, and some of them are just you imprint a wax seal in a certain astrological hour, and then you can take that wax seal, or maybe it's a seal made of a certain kind of incense, like a gummy, resiny type thing. And then you might give that in a drink to someone who was stung by a scorpion sting. And what that'll do is redirect, essentially, the rays that are causing that, let's say, degenerative or corrupting effect, and cause that effect to subside. So the more common operations that you'll find, so those are kind of like medical operations, and you'll find a number of those. Other operations that you find are for speaking with the spirits of planets. And these tend to require you to find a specific place that is associated with that planet. So let's say we take Saturn, for example. You would want to find an isolated and remote place, because through the analogy of Saturn in the physical world, again, this world operates on analogy. Saturn is the outermost planet, the most removed, the slowest, the most ponderous, or the weightiest. And so we, by analogy, want to find a low-lying place. We want to find somewhere that is distant and removed from people. We want to, the Picatrix will tell us, to dress up as a Jew, all dressed in black. And now the associations between Saturn and the Jews goes back quite a bit. It's in Tacitus. It's in a whole bunch of different sources in antiquity. But this really got fleshed out throughout the Middle Ages, and this association between Jews and Saturn became quite prominent, especially in Europe in the 15th century. But so you will find a humble place. You will dress yourself as a Jew. You will go humbly to this place with a talisman made of the metals of that specific planet. That talisman has to be cast in the specific planetary hours that are instructed. Then you have to suffumigate that image, that talisman. Often, now this is one passage that recommends this, and it's uncertain to what extent this has to be extrapolated out to other rituals, but they say to set up a tin cross, or I guess not tin in this particular instance, maybe lead or something like that. And it's a hollow tube that has the 4 cardinal directions. And you're supposed to hang your talisman on this cross and then have the suffumigation go up through that tube and up toward the stars, depending on, what the hours are. You want it to be facing a certain direction. And the idea is that through the talisman being suffumigated, through the ingredients that the talisman is comprised of, through the ingredients that are in the suffumigation, you're basically like bringing together the world. You're bringing together all of these things that will attract the spirit of the planet of Saturn. And that will provoke an experience where you will be able to essentially pray. And again, you're not praying to Saturn, you're praying to God that he will, or you're praying to the spirit on behalf of God. God is always number one in this. And then essentially you have to ask a request. After you've beseeched through the right prayers, you've made the right suffumigation, you've made the right talisman, you've found the right location, you found the right times. Once you have all of these things figured out, then you can do your ritual, offer your prayer, ask your request, and now your request too has to pertain to the spirit of that planet. Each planet has different requests which are appropriate to them. And that is essentially how the magic of the Picatrix is done. But again, there's a lot of rituals, and some things that are true of some rituals are not true of other rituals. There are some rituals that don't have any of this stuff. They're just like find a giant well and go like get a light in a lantern. So you get a lantern so that the light won't go out, and you go to the bottom of the well and you can set up some lights in this well, summoning specific spirits with specific names. You'll be able to scry in that well, essentially. There's a whole bunch of different operations. They don't all operate on the same principles, and this is where you get this, these 200 sources coming out. It's like these are all different magical practices, but it isn't necessarily true that what's true for one ritual can be said about all the others. Picatrix is hard because it's not something that you can just read all the way through from cover to cover and be like, okay, I got it. It's something that you use as a book. Let's say if you were constructing a chart or something like that, or you would read through it and then you would go back through it and you would try to check all of the specifics. And it's hard to, without, coming up with, unless we're doing a specific request, to come up with the exact conditions that we need. But you can use it as a guide for that. I don't know how specific you want to get into things like the mansions or the decans.
Or as specific as you would enjoy yourself to.
Well, this probably is shy of talent, reading out what the actual mansions do. There's not terribly much I can say about it.
So I'm curious how the Picatrix. So basically, this is an Arabic collection of knowledge that basically the Arabs had collected knowledge from late antiquity, and also they had their own innovations. And this is 10th century. So this knowledge was brought into Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And so what would you say the impact of the Picatrix was upon the Western world?
All right, so the text is produced in the 950s-ish. It doesn't get translated until about the 1250s-ish. So it takes quite some time for the, learned magic of the Arabic world to penetrate into the West. And then when it does, it doesn't come alone. It comes along with a whole bunch of other works. Works that, you'd probably be familiar with, like The Secret of Secrets, or I was saying, this Al-Kindi's Theory of Rays and that sort of thing. All of these texts are coming to a head in the 13th century. And again, the text doesn't really get circulated very much until the 1450s. And that's when you get, and here's the thing about Picatrix, most references we have to it in the learned material, like the earliest reference to Picatrix is by Johannes Hartlieb, and he is writing basically against this stuff. So a lot of the talk about Picatrix is against it, because already by the 1450s, people's thoughts about magic, about natural magic versus astral determinism is changing. And people are trying to get away from determinism. And that's, humanism is an idea that is, was made in the 19th century and then retrojected into the 15th century. What they had was the Studia Humanitatis, and this was just a resurrection of the classics. And one of the things that they wanted to kind of get rid of was this hard determinism. They thought, oh, the stars, they incline, but they don't force us to do a certain thing. So it's more about influence than about cause. And Picatrix fits fairly strictly in this world of causal magic, where if you have the right ingredients, if you have the right things, it will work, because that's just how the universe is created. Whereas by the 1450s, there are all sorts of different competing traditions. So the term magician is pretty equivocal. If we look at Ficino and Pico, they're both magicians. They're both fairly closely related geographically and temporally, but they're massively different in their approach to magic. One is more interested in Kabbalah, the other more interested in spirit redirecting hymnody. And so these are kind of different approaches. One is more Neoplatonic, the other one is more Kabbalistic. So, for example, Pico, like Ficino, had this Prisca Theologia narrative in his mind that there was a kind of original source of wisdom that was passed on from Adam, from the angels, on through Enoch, and so on and so forth. And he names a bunch of names that are people in this tradition, and he very conspicuously omits Hermes Trismegistus. And this is something that Ficino, because he was the translator of the Corpus Hermeticum, Ficino saw Hermes as one of the integral parts of the wisdom narrative, but Pico saw him more as, I don't know, an idolater or a sorcerer or somebody who he didn't really see much wisdom in, because it wasn't the same wisdom that he was after. And so the Picatrix is influential in a number of ways because it represents, even in the Renaissance, an older way of thinking and a more traditional way. And there were definitely people practicing and interested in that kind of magic, but they're not usually authors. They're not the people who are writing these great works like Ficino or Pico or Agrippa necessarily. They were often people with clients who kept a low profile, and those people existed. So John Dee, for example, gets accused by other people of being a conjurer, and he hates it. He hates when people say that he's a conjurer. He's like, I'm not a conjurer. This is what I do is serious. It's, it's Kabbalah. It's like plumbing the depths of nature. But that's what the conjurers would think that they're doing. So there's very distinct traditions going on, and some of them are idiosyncratic to the individual practitioners. But Picatrix is definitely a book that was getting circulated. It was getting used. It was getting copied. People had it in their libraries. But largely, people were careful about it. Ficino, for example, when he writes letters to his friends, telling them about, you get one letter to Ficino, and it's asking him if the guy can borrow his copy of the Picatrix. And he warns him against this book, saying, like, there's a lot of good stuff in this book, but you really got to be careful of the conjuration stuff, because, you're a good Christian, you shouldn't be messing around with this stuff. So if you're going to do the magic from it, stick with building talismans, which is the natural magic, right? That's the channeling astral forces. You're not flirting with demonic possession or anything like that. So Ficino was aware of that. Either that or he was just being careful. We can never really tell. We don't know if when people are writing, if they're writing very cautiously or if they're wearing their heart on their sleeve. But what we have is the evidence, and the evidence points to the fact that the learned people like Ficino, like Pico, they had access, they had copies, but they were skeptical because they were moving forward into different forms of magic. And we see that in people like Reuchlin or like John Dee, especially. John Dee's magic is very different from the Picatrix. In fact, John Dee's magic is arguably more influenced by Joachim of Fior's letter mysticism and the theories of rays of Al-Kindi and how those work together than it is for the Picatrix. So, the monad hieroglyphica, that's one of these kind of magic letters or sigils or hieroglyphs that contains the whole world. Well, who was doing that first? Joachim of Fior was, with his claim that when God said, "I am the Alpha and the Omega," he meant it literally. He meant that the shape of time and of space and of history is unfurling in this Alpha Omega pattern. And John Dee had similar ideas based on the monad, or monas, I guess. But it has varying degrees of influence for various people. But when it surfaces, what we know from the literature is that people were moving on to different forms of magic, but there was definitely still people practicing the old form. They just weren't writing about it. They were doing it quietly in order to avoid trouble.
Yeah, so I'm wondering about something that happened in this movement in Renaissance magic. I was just wondering about your take on the three worlds and if they are found in the Picatrix.
Oh, totally, yeah. Yeah, so there are actually, I think, 3 or 4 distinct hierarchies of being that are stated in the Picatrix. And this is kind of an innovation in a way, because al-Qurtubi, instead of synthesizing all of the works that he inherits into one thing and saying, like, this is how the world works, he says some wise people think it works this way. And then he lays out the cosmology, like the great hierarchy of being with God at the top and with, mind descending below him, like the sphere of the spirit, if you will, and then soul within that, and then matter and so forth. But there's definitely, it's not fleshed out in the same way. Like, for example, you won't find in it the same hierarchies as you would find in Dionysius the Areopagite. So it's not like, angels, archangels, thrones, and dominions and principalities and all that kind of stuff. It's a different cosmology that's largely focused on the Ruhaniya, which are the spirits that surround the planets. And they're kind of like images. There's this kind of bleeding between what an image and a spirit is, if that makes sense. That's why translating it as spirits is kind of, it robs it a bit of what was meant when people use the word Ruhaniya, because it had different associations. But in any case, Europe, when it got it, it was through the spirits. But the three worlds are present, and they're present in different forms. Like I said, he gives 4 different hierarchies of being that are as per the opinion of different thinkers. And this is kind of scientific in a way because in our modern sense of scientific, because he's not forcing it to a close. He's just like, I'm going to tell you what other people think and leave that as it is without telling you which one is the correct one. But they're all fairly analogous, and you get, the elemental world below that is corruptible, the sublunary world. You get the world above the moon between the fixed stars and the moon, and that world is incorruptible, pure, but it's still changing. It's just not degenerating. And then you have the pure world, the celestial world that's beyond the stars, and that's where God dwells, and where the light of God shines in through and gets poured down by the Ruhaniya into the world. And so, I think that when Agrippa is working on his 3 books, he's definitely got Picatrix somewhere in there. It's just that he's fleshing it out in more depth. He wants to build the whole cosmos in kind of vivid detail, whereas the Picatrix is more tentative and gives a couple of theories and says well, here's a couple theories and they're all fairly similar, but that's how your magic operates, is through understanding this hierarchy.
So basically, as you said, there is the divine realm, where there are different ways to put the hierarchy, but essentially at the highest level is, I guess, God and his angels. And then beneath this are the stars, the planets, the zodiac.
Yeah.
And then beneath this is the elementary. So basically you would take items associated with, let's say, Mars, such as iron, or, as an example, or incenses of Mars. And during the proper astrological timing, when Mars, as an example, is auspicious in the heavens, you would take the items in the elementary world, and basically you can just leave it at that. You're doing, like what Ficino would say, natural magic. You're calling on the celestial, but you could also call upon the spirits beyond through the planet. So basically you're pulling on sort of like strings of sympathies.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And now I think maybe the word angels might be a little problematic, because there are no angels in the way. Well, actually, that's not true. Angels is a complicated term. Usually the Picatrix just calls them spirits, but also in some of the invocations, they say the angel of such and such a planet. And I suppose those are, messengers is essentially what's meant. And the messages are delivered through the spirit. It's just that in modern day, we think of spirit as non-material, whereas spirits operate through matter, albeit through subtler means, through the air, through fire, through the subtle vibrations in a bowl of water or something like that. That's why a lot of people today use, radio scanners and things like that, because if the spirits talk to you, they're going to do it through physical means, but through subtle spiritual physical means, because the idea is on the great chain of being, what is that? Earth or water are the lowest, most unsubtle or gross things, as it's called. And as you rise the hierarchy of being, you're getting into more rarefied states. And so, water is more rarefied than earth. Air is more rarefied than water. Fire is more rarefied than air. And then the spiritual substance that the planets are made of is even more rarefied. And that's why they are literally higher physically in the air. And the world is kind of like a gradation of from subtlety to density. And we live in the dense part, and God is, the utmost subtle part. And so God, when he operates through these layers of subtlety, and gradually that ripples downwards, influencing the gross material world.
But God works through agents, essentially. Like
Yes.
we have spiritual creatures that we like. Basically, God could like just directly perform miracles, but essentially, this idea, kind of like Tritemius in his like many Renaissance magicians and medieval writers have talked about, that everything seems to filter through these intermediary beings.
Yep. And I mean, even St. Paul believed in this. This is not new or novel in the Renaissance. This is a worldview that's been around forever. And Pico, when he was writing his 900 disputations or theses to argue to the Roman Curia, one of the theses that he had was this heretical thesis called, I guess he just said, there is no surer proof of Christ's divinity than through the science of magic and Kabbalah. And I've explained this elsewhere. What he meant by that is not so much that if you study magic and Kabbalah, you will come to a sure knowledge of Christ, but that when Christ was on earth, he did miracles, he did magic, he did great wonders through himself. He didn't need to build talismans. He didn't need to use geomancy. He didn't summon spirits. He just did the miracles through himself. And so the idea from Pico's perspective is that Christ, since he is God, and all magic ultimately it comes from God as like a final cause, a distant cause. Here we have Christ incarnate doing the work of God, and that is how you are assured of his divinity, is his ability to work with the makeup of the world, albeit not through channeling the stuff of God as other magicians do.
Okay, now, how did the book get the name The Picatrix? Because there was one time I was in a forum, and as soon as I mentioned the grimoire of the Picatrix, someone automatically assumed that it was a fictional grimoire because of the name.
So we actually don't know for sure, but we have a number of working theories. Now, originally, people thought that Picatrix was a corrupt form of Hippocrates, but the thing is that Hippocrates doesn't have any magical works associated to him, and the other thing is that Hippocrates appears as one of the sources in the Picatrix, and his name is Hippocras. And so we know that why would, it appear as Picatrix in the title and Hippocras in the text. So I should state right off the bat that Picatrix is both the name of the author and the name of the book. So sometimes I say the Picatrix, and that's usually when I'm talking about the book. And sometimes I just say Picatrix, and then I'm talking about the author as conceived by Europeans, because they didn't know that it was this Maslama al-Qurtubi. And one of the theories is that the name Picatrix is an attempt at Spanishizing the name Maslama. They thought that the letters that basically constitute Maslama, MLS, can mean, it doesn't often mean, but it can mean to sting or to prick or to bite. And so people associated the Picatrix with the biter or the stinger. And so you might get this imagery of a serpent who is giving you wisdom, right? So the serpent is often a figure associated with wisdom, and the book is called The Goal of the Sage. And so I think somebody might have thought of, like, this is the stinger or the biter or the goader. That's one theory. And there are others. I had one theory, and it's just a guess, and I wouldn't put too much weight on it. I thought maybe there's a wizard from the ancient Egypt called Pancrates. Basically, all powerful is what the name means, and I was wondering if Picatrix might be like a Latinization or a Spanishization, Hispanization, I don't know, of the word Pancrates, as this kind of sorcerer from antiquity. But again, nobody knew about this guy. There's no evidence for that, so it's just a guess. So ultimately, the name is inconclusive, but it probably has to do with rendering some sort of Arabic word into Spanish, and we just don't know for sure what that is. And now Maslama, again, when they came up with that theory, they were applying it to Maslama al-Majriti, and it's actually not Maslama al-Majriti who wrote the book, it's Maslama al-Qurtubi, but then his name is also Maslama, so that would still work. But Liana Seif has expressed some level of dissatisfaction with this hypothesis. So you'll see in our introduction, we give a number of these hypotheses, and we kind of just don't settle on any of them because it's all inconclusive. Can I ask you guys something?
Sure.
If you aren't in a rush. How did both of you get interested in Picatrix?
Oh, I initially found this years ago. Even I would say it was right after I found Crowley. Then I moved on to Agrippa for one odd reason or another, and the Picatrix was one of the primary sources for the second book. So that's how I sort of stumbled upon it.
That makes sense. That seems to be an in for a lot of people, I think, and it makes perfect sense that it would be.
For myself, I started at a really young age getting into the occult, but I've been studying the occult for 24 years but it was mostly just modern stuff, like pretty much just all modern stuff. It wasn't until I guess about 10 years ago that I started getting into more of the classic, a little bit the classical stuff. Like it was mostly modern with a little bit of classical here and there.
Right.
But I think I first got into Agrippa because like that is the book that you read if you want to understand classical magic. And I think it was after, I don't remember the exact circumstances, but it's like I was reading through Agrippa, and then I think on online forums or something, people started talking about the Picatrix. So, but it would be a few years before I actually started reading the material. But yeah, basically through Agrippa is kind of how I did it.
Nice.
So how about yourself? How did you get involved in all of this and into the Picatrix?
So, I mean, I was technically hired into it, you could say. I was studying mystery cults and also Islamic history and Greek and Latin poetry and the classics, essentially. And so I did my undergraduate with a double major in history and classics. The history side of things was largely dedicated to Islamic history and Greek and Roman history and just medieval history in general. And then my other angle was mystery cults. And so that's what I ended up going to do my MA for. And while I was working on mystery cults in Waterloo, my supervisor, David Pareca, basically he got a research grant for the work that he was doing. And he had started back in, I think, 2009, translating the Picatrix by hand into this little black book of his. And he asked me if I was interested in kind of finishing up the work and finishing the translation, polishing it up, getting it up to standards, transcribing, polishing, doing notes, writing an introduction. Like, it ended up being 8 years of work. So that's initially, this was his project, and he took me on board as kind of a co-author, and I was ecstatic. I mean, that was probably the highest honor that somebody could do to me at the time, and probably still, because he had really done the initial hurdle. He had spent time in the trenches doing, the really annoying drudge work, the translating the astrological passages, the mansions, the various stars, all of the technical grind stuff. He had been very diligent, and kind of just, I came on board and we revamped the whole thing and made it publishable. And there was also, within the last, I suppose, 10 years, 8 years, it's been a lot of publications about Picatrix. There's been a lot of new discoveries, and I was kind of in charge of keeping up with that stuff and incorporating it and including it, and doing the research in the sources and what are the constituent parts of the Picatrix. And a lot of this was stimulated by he and I both attend a medieval conference in Kalamazoo, Michigan every year, and that's where the Societas Magica gathers to basically go over all of our scholarship that we're doing. And we kept writing papers and putting together presentations about various aspects of the work we were doing, and those eventually got distilled into the introduction of the text, into the footnotes, and that sort of thing. And yeah, so my interest in the Picatrix is, I think, unusual compared to a lot of people who typically come at it from a practical magic point of view. They're interested in talismanic magic, and then they start checking out Agrippa, and then they find themselves involved in Picatrix. I found myself coming from Islamic history, medieval history, and Latin philology angle. So for me, it was really like more of a quest to produce a reliable, interesting, work of translation than it was more so to produce a work that is something that I suppose magicians might use. I've always thought of myself more as a person who's writing for a scholarly audience. Not that magicians aren't scholarly and scholars aren't magicians. It's just that people usually keep these things distinct. That's something Wouter Hanegraaff writes a lot about, is what's called the religionist view, and how you should be able to have the religionist view, the insider view, if you will, but also not allow it to affect how you interact with evidence, how you interact with the sources, that sort of thing. You should feign objectivity, even if the objectivity is actually impossible. So that's my angle. I got hired into it to sort of be a helper, and then eventually I was taken on full time, and then we put some more years of work into it, and now it's finally done.
Well, when it comes to the work, there are other versions of the book out there.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your version, what is the goal of the translation?
So our methodology was, so there are other translations in English. There are two other translations. One is done by a gentleman who I don't know his name. I believe he even goes by a pseudonym, perhaps. And that's the version published by Ouroboros Press. And that's a translation from the Arabic into English. But, I don't read Arabic, but Liana Seif does, and she's, not terribly pleased with that version. If she was, she wouldn't really be taking all the time to publish a new critical edition and translation of the Ghayat al-Hakim. But the main impetus of our translation was to produce one that was kind of interested in historicity. We wanted to produce one that was strictly concerned with the Latin reception of the text in the Renaissance. So the other version that's out right now by Greer and Warnock, which is also a good version, it's made for practicing magicians. And so a lot of detail is paid on how to do these rituals correctly in the purest form. And so there are often cross-references with the Arabic version. And what it creates is a kind of chimeric version, which is good if you're trying to get the most amount of rituals for your buck, if you will. But it's not necessarily what was read in the past. And so now, if you wanted to read what they read in the past, you've got to go and actually read the Latin, and because that's how they were reading it. But our translation is an attempt at, firstly, doing something elegant that is like readable. There's a lot of things in the Picatrix that when you translate it, it's just really wordy, and we wanted to try to cut down on that. So in antiquity, sorry, not in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, they didn't have punctuation. So they would use connecting words. And so, for example, one of our practices has been to get rid of those because we have punctuation. And so we don't need to clutter the text with all these additional little particles if we just translate it in a legible, kind of elegant way. So we sought elegance, we sought historicity. We have a lot of footnotes, but so do the other versions. Another thing is that we looked at after all the work was done and in putting together footnotes and stuff like that, we looked at all the other modern English editions and we triangulated. So we looked at the Italian version, we looked at the German version in some instances when we needed to, and we looked at other English versions, and we looked at the French version. And so, for example, if there's an ingredient where we're uncertain, you just got to go to the footnote, and the footnote will say, well, the Italian version tells you this, the French version tells you this, Greer and Warnock tell you this, and this is what we think it is. And so we don't have that for every ingredient because some of the ingredients are pretty concrete. It's pretty obvious what they are, but there are a good number of ingredients that either were left unidentified or they are misidentified. And it's likely that we also, have some of our ingredients that also suffer from misidentification or whatnot. It's very difficult when you're dealing with pre-Linnaean taxonomy of metals and vegetables and animals. I suppose metals don't really count in this post-Linnaean world, but people use words to cover more than what we mean when we use words. So our scientific language is very specific, whereas the language of the past, they use more umbrella terms. So if they call for a certain plant, it might be a number of plants that are in that family rather than a very specific plant. But, we did our research. We checked all sorts of things. We we checked out chemical dictionaries and different. I found dictionaries, and we even used dictionaries that had mistakes in them. One of them was translating an ingredient called alcondis as hellebore, black hellebore, and it's not. It's aconite, which is a poison that was commonly used in India and brought into the West, probably around the time of Alexander the Great. And so, that's one of these ingredients where we're like, even this dictionary has it wrong. Alcondis is aconite, in Arabic, aconiten. And so now we've fixed that. And then, so you look at the passage that has this in it, and I think in the Greer and Warnock version, if I remember correctly, it's something along the lines of, if you put this hellebore, or maybe they don't even translate it, I'm not sure, on a piece of metal, it will corrode the metal or something like that. And now when I read the Latin, I read something very different. I read if you put this poison on a sword, the word is ferrum, which in Latin can mean iron, but it can just as easily mean a sword. And what is being described here is how to poison a weapon. And aconite was very often used as a weapon poison, or an arrow poison. And so, this is just like one example of many things. So we did our research, we looked at ingredients, we looked at stuff, and we tried to come up with a cohesive picture of what it is that the people in the Renaissance would have been reading and how they would have read it. And we're concerned with the Western reception of the text. That's kind of our modus operandi.
And that's like the perfect book to understand the history of the transmission of the text in the West, because I mean this is the Latin text that was read by, or this is basically essentially the version that was read by Agrippa and by Ficino and all of them. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, there are specific talismans in Ficino's 3 books on life that are very obviously taken right from the Latin Picatrix.
And what is the date of the release date and all of that stuff, that kind of detail?
So it's being printed right now, and it will be published on February 8th, which is actually Pareca's birthday.
Oh,
so
wow.
Yeah, it's just a pleasant coincidence, actually.
Yeah, well, we appreciate that, Dan. I mean, I know that with you coming on, that just with me and you alone over the past year and a half, as soon as you came out and announced it, and then you made an excellent video, too, about what it takes to be a mage based on the Picatrix. And I am so glad that this is out. I actually got my pre-order ready for it, and to me, this is going to be a big deal just based on the context of the premise you're writing this on, based on the historiography of the text too. And I think it's going to be a real gem.
Yep, I'm very excited for people to get it into people's hands, and I'm also open to comments and feedback from people. If someone thinks I'm wrong, that's perfectly okay. Just tell me, like, fire me up an email or send me a message somewhere. And because this is a first edition, we will most likely publish subsequent editions because this is an academic text, and we're always looking for the most, accurate, up-to-date version. I would suggest people, get their versions early, because the first run of prints is only 1,000, and those are the hardcover editions. And so they'll probably print more, but when they do print more, they'll print more in paperback and in hardcover. So it may be harder to find yourself a nice, simple black-bound, cloth-bound book that's 300 some odd pages. We also have an index, which I've been kind of clamoring about. There's a tremendous amount of work. It's like 80 pages.
That's insane.
Wow, 80 page index. Man, y'all went through a lot of work on that.
Oh yeah, that was actually all David. I was working on my PhD examinations and stuff, so I couldn't work on that and meet the deadlines. So he basically pulled a bunch of all-nighters, and it's not just like an index where you want to find the word. He'll give you like the word, and then like the word in many different contexts that it's being used. So it's a really thorough index.
Wow.
Yeah, that's almost unheard of, wow, that's really amazing. So basically we're about to have the first set of books, 1,000 books that are about to go into circulation, 1,000 copies, and they're all hardbound and all of that. And so this would be the first run, where it's basically special edition, hardbound, and all of that good stuff. So there'll only be 1,000 copies.
Well, they'll print more afterward, but it's like they'll print it in both hard copy and in paperback. So it's like if you want to make sure you get a hard copy instead of just being at the mercy of whatever winds up in your local bookstore or whatever, I would suggest getting it as soon as you can. And yeah, and I'd love to hear people's feedback, and I'm always open to learning more about the subject. Another big part of it is the bibliography. I mean, we have this really up-to-date kind of bibliography with all the stuff you could ever want to know about the Picatrix. Is all you can find it all in one place, as long as you have a JSTOR account or some sort of account to log into these journal databases or a library that has these books, because they're usually fairly rare. But yeah, it'll all be there.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this is such a huge part of history. I mean, this magic, this text is basically, over the last 2,000 years, this is like one of the top 5. This is like one of the top texts throughout the history of the last 2,000 years of magic. And I mean, it was written in the 10th century, and even then it was collecting from earlier knowledge. So both for academics, it's a very scholarly work for academics, and also for practitioners and people that want to understand these traditions. Like we all have all these books that were from 19th 20th century, but people today are able to basically hold this piece of history in their hands. This is a vast wisdom tradition that was collected from the 10th century. So to me, I just find that amazing to be able to hold something like that in your hands. I mean, it really is a unique gift and a treasure. So I just wanted to remind everyone, anyone that's listening or watching, be sure to look in the description. I'll be posting this we'll be posting it on YouTube, different social media outlets. But be sure and look in the description, and there'll be a link to where you can order this text. And so you can have this text. Be sure and order. And Theophilos has ordered his, and I've ordered mine. So I'm looking forward to seeing that on my library shelf.
Awesome.
So thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much for being on our show. We really appreciate you. And
Thanks.
maybe we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely.
Oh, hell yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Everyone have a great day.
Yep, you too.
Yep. See ya.